Welcome everyone to Southern Jewish Voices. My name is Brooke Bowles. I'm the Executive Director of the Levitt Jewish Community Center. This is one of our favorite programs that we do here. We received funding through the Alabama Humanities Alliance last fall for us to partner with Jewish individuals in Birmingham and have them come in and share their unique experience of living life as a Jewish person in Birmingham, Alabama. And what's really, really neat about this project is each of these interviews are recorded and on our website in a couple of weeks. It takes a couple of weeks. And so we're not only hearing Madeline's story tonight, but we're also preserving that story. We're archiving it so that she is a part of history of what it's like to live in Birmingham, Alabama as a Jewish person. When we applied for this funding, we really hoped that it would not only attract a Jewish audience, but also a non-Jewish audience to really bring people together and unite individuals and gain a better understanding of each one's life experience. And these videos are getting 500 plus views. I mean, people are really watching. So I know we have a small group here tonight, which is very intimate, but the videos are really, really quite popular. And we've just started this in the fall. So we're so thankful to have Margaret Norman here facilitating our interview and Madeline Oliff. So thanks. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Brooke. So really excited to be here with Madeline tonight. Just to give you a tiny bit of background before we jump in, Madeline grew up in Chicago. She's lived here in Birmingham for several years now, though. She went to Tufts, came here as a Venture for America Fellow, which she's going to tell us a little bit about because I did not understand what Venture for America was before meeting her and all the other Venture for America transplants that are here in Birmingham. But I'm really excited to chat with her. I've enjoyed getting to know Madeline over the last few years. She's younger than I am, but is another youngish, transplant in the city. And I think her perspective is really just going to add a lot to all the conversations that we've had over the last few months. So with that, just to set the stage, how long have you been in Birmingham now, Madeline?
So I moved in September 2020.
Very weird time to move.
Yes, a very weird time, but I always say it was actually a really nice time. As Margaret had mentioned, I'm from Chicago and moved from Boston to Birmingham. Those two places are very cold, and to be honest, they were a lot more COVID conscious than Birmingham. So coming here in September 2020, people were willing to meet me and go on walks outside and have coffees, and I could do that well into November and December, so it made the transition way easier.
Yeah, way better than moving, I guess, north in the fall when it would have been getting cold and dark and hard to meet people. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll come back to that in your transition, but I want to start talking a little bit about your early life. So you grew up in Chicago. I know that your dad was from Chicago, but your mom was from Texas, and that they also had some different Jewish backgrounds. So maybe we can just start talking a little bit about your family and particularly sort of the role of Judaism in your family.
Absolutely. So yes, both my parents grew up Jewish. My mom was raised in a Reform household and my dad in a conservative household. They met when my mom had accepted a 1-year dental fellowship in Chicago, saying, I can take one winter and then I'll go home. But they actually met at a Jewish singles Hanukkah party. Oh, nice. And the rest is history. So they met there and obviously decided to create a family in Chicago. And what I'll also say is we value Judaism, and that was a big part of our household. In a lot of ways, the decisions that they made were, they instilled a Jewish lifestyle, but a lot of it was making decisions that outsourced that Judaism. So I went to Jewish day school from nursery through 8th grade. I went to Jewish summer camp. And Judaism was a big part of my family life, but it was also more so a decision that my parents made to kind of let other Jewish educators and the Jewish community raise us alongside them. So
Yeah, that makes total sense. And we talked a lot in our sort of pre-conversation about the role of day school in your life. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about, what that was like and how that shaped you.
absolutely. So aside from just learning Hebrew starting at age 3, and obviously Jewish studies being almost a daily part of my education, which is a unique element to any education, especially in the U.S., I would say that really set a foundation for who I have become now. We had these random classes with these silly names, but we talked about, there was a class called Big Ideas where we had to argue for or against a big ethical question, and we brought in Jewish values and history and research, and really were able to become creative thinkers and critical thinkers. We also had a consistent element of community service in our education, Tikkun Olam, where we were also able to explore the city of Chicago through the eyes of giving back to our community, which, fast forwarding a little bit, now I am committing my professional career to the nonprofit space, so that definitely can be traced back to those years. But it was just a really great way to set a foundation for a values-based education. I definitely took that community building aspect into when I eventually transitioned into the Chicago public school system after my K through 8 education was done.
Yeah, I want to really quickly go back to the idea of sort of outsourcing Jewish education, because I think that's such a sort of common model now. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on sort of like, I guess, the pros and cons of that approach. And also, I think we talked a little bit about this earlier, but do you feel like your experiences outside the home, I guess, sort of translated back to shaping your family life in the home, if that makes sense?
I would say definitely yes. So I'm the middle of 3 girls, so I had 2 sisters who also went through that same school, and so a lot of our side conversations revolved around school, and therefore it definitely came back into the home. I think what's interesting about it is we didn't keep kosher at home. We didn't really keep Shabbat unless it was to get some family friends together. So it wasn't like Jewish traditions were led by our parents, but they were clearly supported by our parents because of the fact that they invested in Jewish education. Of course, most of my good friends and other mentors and adult figures in my life were also involved in the Jewish community. And again, summer camp, I went to Blue Star in Hendersonville, North Carolina. So when I was literally being outsourced to camp
all the way to North Carolina,
that also had a Jewish element. I think the really exciting part about those things, while outsourcing sounds like a negative thing, I think it allowed me to shape my own Jewish identity in a way that I could see being a challenge or a struggle if it was forced upon me by my parents. In a way, I got to go to school and got to figure out what traditions I liked and wanted to bring back, and figure out what camp songs and tunes I liked, for this prayer or that prayer that I got to bring back. And ultimately, again, I'm speeding up a little bit, but when I did transition onto a secular public school, that's when I started freaking out and realizing, where's my Jewish community? I don't necessarily see that here. And that's when I had that internal motivation to go and seek it out. And I think if I had this steady, omnipresent sense of Judaism in the home, I wouldn't have needed to finally pursue it on my own at age 13 or 14 when I ended up joining BBYO in Chicago.
Yeah, I love that idea, and maybe we'll return to that a little bit too when we talk about sort of the uniqueness of being a Jew in the South as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I do want to ask you about, so like speaking of making choices, so you chose to go to a public high school instead of going on to a private school or maybe another Jewish context. But can you tell me a little bit about that decision and also what that transition into secular education was like?
Yeah, so Chicago is a little bit unique that there are, for a lot of 8th graders, which is crazy to think that I was 12 and 13 when I was going through this process. It's basically a mini college process where you take exams, you write essays, and you apply to a bunch of different schools. There were a handful of private, mostly still secular schools. There were your traditional neighborhood schools, and then there was a group of schools called selective enrollment schools that were public schools, but you had to test and opt into. And so it was a lot of pressure for a 13-year-old, and you have to really think about, what do I want out of my education? Who are the people I want to surround myself with? How long do I want to take to get to school?
That's a lot.
Which is, and for a lot of people at age 12 and 13, they're not really making those decisions. Usually it's their parents making those decisions. I ended up choosing to go to a different school than my older sister, and ultimately my younger sister followed my older sister, so I was the odd one out, the rebellious middle child. And honestly, if my parents had their choice, I probably wouldn't have gone to the school that I had gone to.
And what was sort of special about this school that you picked it out?
So this school, Whitney Young, was one of those selective enrollment schools. You had to test into it, but it was a public school. And I went to the shadow day, and it was the pep rally day for the women's basketball team. And I got home, and my dad said, "Did you feel like you were on Glee?" Which was like the really big show at the time. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's it. You had the cheerleaders, you had the basketball team, you had the band playing, you had obviously like the chess team had probably come out with their trophy. So you had like the archetypes of everything, and that's when it kind of clicked, like this is, it's kind of would be cool to be going to a high school that is like what high school looks like on TV. And while there were, other ups and downs along the way, it definitely feels a lot like what was on TV after the 4 years. It took a bus and a train to get there every day. So I was taking the CTA to get to school, and it was just a really unique experience. But I also was ready to, I think why I still to this day value my experience at my day school was that everyone was like me to a certain extent. I had a connection to everyone. I really knew almost everyone. There were only 500 students throughout all those years, and I knew their families, and I think I wanted the exact opposite. I wanted to see and meet and learn alongside people who were very different from me. I wanted to have to take a bus and a train to get to other people's houses in different neighborhoods when we had after school play dates. Wasn't really a thing in high school, but y'all get what I mean. Hanging out, and that's the experience that I got. So
tell us, just to sort of close that chapter too, how did that, so you kind of mentioned earlier that you get there and you're having a good experience, but you also sort of freak out a little bit at sort of the absence of Judaism. So what's that like? Yeah,
so there was definitely other Jews, and there were a handful of people who went from my day school to that school with me. Both from the grades above and in my grade. So I still had those connections that I had made, but there wasn't that same sense of community. There wasn't the same sense of pride and visibility of my identity in the way that I I mean, I never felt like I'd experienced anti-Semitism or didn't feel like I couldn't be prideful of my identity, but it wasn't something that I could just go to someone and have a connection with.
Yeah.
So that's when I decided to join BBYO in Chicago. There was, at the time, one boys chapter and one girls chapter, and maybe it was 2 or 3 years in, but that really became such a central part of my high school identity. I joined freshman year, I joined the board sophomore year, which I loved. I was the recruitment chair, so I got to get everyone else to go and really targeted a lot of the other students that I had built relationships with in day school and who are now off, you know, in all the different schools around the city. And from there, I started going to the BBYO leadership development camps. So then I started building a national network of people. Eventually got more involved at a regional level, and oversaw the Great Midwest region, which sounded great, especially for college applications. It really was only like an hour radius around the Chicagoland area, but Great Midwest region, you know.
Yeah, it sounds like it encompasses
official.
a large area.
But it was such an impactful experience. It showed me what it meant to be a leader. It showed me what it meant to be a cheerleader, so leading from behind. It gave me that national network. If I got, thankfully, most flights to Chicago are direct, but if I got stranded in any city in the U.S., I would probably have someone to call because of my BBYO experience. And it just gave me that outlet of still connecting to my Judaism, but also starting to define it and redefine it with their Jewish enrichment, but also beyond just the direct Jewish experiences. It had also just given me back that community of, you know, meeting someone new and playing Jewish geography and meeting 5 people that, you know, we have in common. So getting that back was really important for me at that time.
I love how intentional you were about like seeking that out, and I think we'll see that as a bit of a theme for you as you continue through spaces that are more or less Jewish. But it sounds like it did sort of set a precedent of, okay, I'm in this not totally Jewish environment now, so I'm going to find a way to connect that works for me. And I know summer camp was part of that, and the one other experience I kind of wanted to ask you about was, I'm hopefully getting this timeline right, but you do go on Alexander Musson High School, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I know that was sort of this pivotal and interesting and kind of complicated moment for you, too.
Yeah, so I had gone to Israel with my Jewish day school. I had gone with my family, but probably the most important experience in Israel was through Alexander Musson High School in Israel. The elevator pitch is that it's 6 or 7 weeks of learning by doing. So you are reading about and learning about the history of the Jewish people and the state of Israel, and one day you're reading it and the next day you're going to wherever that history took place.
Yeah.
Which was just an incredible experience as someone who loves to learn and is a visual learner, to actually be able to just hop on a bus and see it.
Yeah.
So that was amazing. But then there was another layer on top of it, because it happened to be the summer of 2014, which was a particularly
just crazy time to be a high school
in
student
Israel. Ultimately, in the first 2 or 3 weeks that I got there were some small but, you know, minor blips in what generally is Israel's history. But then it increased to a level of instability, unlike a lot of times.
Yeah.
Which, you know, ultimately we were kind of had to stay on campus in Hod Sharon, and we were in and out of bomb shelters throughout the summer. I'd gotten plenty of calls saying, you gotta come home, and I was like, absolutely not. But in the context of learning this history and going to see it, it was a totally separate experience to have our phones and be in real time experiencing history, and a history that wasn't necessarily filterable by our teachers, who were promoting, a narrative that is, pro-Israel. And so it was honestly a really important formation of my adulthood, and recognizing it's not just what people are telling me I need to do, or it allowed me to, it encouraged me to ask questions, it encouraged me to make my own opinions, and encouraged me to seek out a variety of voices, and that also made it really hard to come back home. When fire drills were happening, and that was kind of triggering, or other peers had not had such life-changing experiences, and I was like, come on. Or it was just it was a challenging transition back, even though it was challenging to be there in a time where most Americans don't have to think about their safety in a matter of a minute or two. And ultimately, that made, fast forward 2 years when I participated in March of the Living with BBYO, that made it even more challenging because we would spend 1 week in Poland, going around and learning about Jewish history from the lens of the Holocaust, and then and celebrate Holocaust Memorial Day, and the next week in Israel during Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom HaZikaron, and we have every right to celebrate Jewish, the state of Israel and how far we've come. But I was still reminiscing about all the things that I had just been experiencing 2 years prior, figuring out how to grapple with, where I stood and how do I connect with Israel, because I think a lot of young Jewish people associate their Judaism with their connection to Israel. And I think in that time I realized that my relationship to Judaism is one thing, and my relationship to Israel is another thing, and I can value those both and struggle with those both. That's what Israel means.
And it
means
sounds
to
like
struggle
what your
with.
Judaism means too. I mean, what's so interesting to me about this for you too is that you sort of talked about how your Jewish education had prepared you to be sort of questioning and grappling. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like those were ethics that you'd received as a young person and took with you in this sort of pivotal identity forming moment as a teenager, which I feel like I was not emotionally mature enough to handle any of that as a teenager, so it's really interesting to hear you talk about that. Okay, we could stay on that for hours, but I will move us along, even though it's very interesting. And so I know next you go to Tufts, and I will get us to Birmingham, I promise. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about just a little bit about your college life and Jewish involvement, and I'd love if you could lead us into getting to Memphis, which I know is sort of a step before Birmingham and your first time experiencing Judaism in the South. So these things are interconnected.
Yes. So Tufts is one of those interesting communities. It's a small liberal arts school outside of Boston, and there is a thriving Jewish community there. It's, I don't know the percentage now, but it was like 20 or 30% Jewish, so significant. So it's one of those things where even if you weren't active in Jewish life on campus, you were connected in some way. But But I would say, I definitely stayed involved and did a lot of tried a lot of different things to stay Jewish on campus. I was involved in Hillel. I was involved. I went to Chabad. They had the best food. I was involved, in both community building as well as the Israeli dialogue on campus. I took Hebrew. Tufts had a hefty language requirement of 6 semesters,
Wow.
so I was able to knock out 4, and I took a year of Hebrew. And
That's
yeah,
a lot of Hebrew. Hebrew must actually be really good.
it's not anymore,
Okay.
but it was fine.
It was.
But so it was it wasn't like the premier thing. I didn't necessarily study Judaic studies, but it was always something that every semester or probably once a week I was somehow connected to the Jewish community on campus. But in regards to Memphis, I had just finished out being a camp counselor at my Jewish summer camp, and it was time to get a real job, and I had nothing on my resume basically except for being a Jewish camp counselor. So I needed to figure out what to do with that, and my other goal was to not go home to Chicago for the summer. I wanted to do something different.
Yeah.
So I'd heard about it was called the Temple Israel Fellowship program that is basically funded by one of the temples in Memphis to bring a cohort of Jewish college students, give them housing. We all were roommates, and we got to have internships in Memphis. So most internships didn't necessarily have a Jewish component. It was just, the programming on the weekends and the fact that we were all Jewish kind of is what brought us together and was the rationale. I just so happened to have a somewhat Jewish experience for my internship. I worked at Facing History and Ourselves, which is I don't really remember the pitch, but it started out as a Holocaust education nonprofit, the first of its kind in the 70s when people weren't really talking about the Holocaust so much. So what does it mean to bring that curriculum into schools and to train teachers to talk about the Holocaust in schools? So my main project was working with second-generation Holocaust survivors to craft their narratives so that they could be representatives of their parents when, as that generation dwindles, unfortunately. So gearing them up to feel confident in going into classrooms and sharing not only their parents' stories, but their stories, because their stories matter as well. So that was really amazing
cool
to get to work with these. I worked with 4 wonderful ladies in Memphis. But one of the other things was I kind of helped around the office, and in my first or second week there was a 4 or 5 day Holocaust education professional development for teachers, and all the teachers in Memphis, or at least in this group, as well as my colleagues, none of them at least openly identified as Jewish. So in my context, I assumed that I was the only Jewish person in the room, and one of the most fascinating probably hours of my time in this internship was the fact that they were talking about why could there be such a hatred of Jewish people, and a lot of it was about the relationship with Jesus and what the Bible said and all that, and it was just like fascinating to hear it from the other side, because I've had a lot of Holocaust education, but it's in rooms with all Jewish people, and then to hear people finally kind of struggle with, well, that's my people that you're saying, inspired some of these horrible and, the genocide of the Jewish people. So it was interesting to see adults in the Memphis community thinking through, and it's not their direct implications, but just the theories behind it. So aside from that, I had such a wonderful time there. Just being able to live such a leisurely, slow life, which was not what I was accustomed to in Chicago or in Boston. People actually saying hi to me on the street or waving. The heat was nothing because everything was air conditioned. Yeah. So, and Boston, you didn't have air conditioning in the summer, so everyone might fall.
Yes.
So it was just, so I had kind of at that point realized I wanted to move back to the South once I had graduated. You know, I still had 2 more years at Tufts, but ultimately I was hoping to eventually get back to the South because of that experience.
Well, with that in mind, tell us about coming to Birmingham, and also for those of us not in the know, do explain what Venture for America is and like how you plugged in with that program specifically. And of course, in coming to Birmingham too, I do know that you had family here already, both your sister who was already a VFA fellow and the Sikoras, who many people watching might know.
Yes. So, you know, the interesting thing about typing in to Google fellowships in the South, I mean, they are all like Christian or mission-oriented fellowships. Sense. So it was very challenging for me to kind of put together the fact that I wanted to move somewhere in the South, but I wasn't Christian, but I also didn't want to just move for a job. I wanted a community.
So you were looking for a fellowship specifically,
exactly.
Something that would have a cohort and a timeline.
Exactly. I felt like that would kind of ease the moving
sense.
To a new city post-college process. So ultimately, I ended up applying to Venture for America, which is an entrepreneurship fellowship program, for post-grads looking to work in the startup and innovation spaces in mid-sized cities. So I knew that Birmingham was on the list of places because my sister had moved with Venture for America 2.5 years at the time that I was applying. And so I knew that moving to the South with a secular but like-minded group was a possibility. At that point, I really hadn't had much entrepreneurship experience, but I just, as we young people say, shot my shot, and got my acceptance in December 2019, which was crazy because as someone who studied sociology and American studies, to have my job before my second semester of my senior year was kind of unheard of.
Not a lot of people in humanities having that experience.
Exactly. And then much less February 2020 and the world is shutting down. Most of my peers graduating in 2020 didn't have a job lined up. So that being said, you kind of get accepted to the program, but you don't actually start looking for your specific placement until late spring. And I explicitly was not going to move to Birmingham. New Orleans was an option. Charlotte was an option. Although it wasn't in the South, Detroit was an option, and that would have been nice to be close to home. But Birmingham, I was not going there. That was my sister's thing. I'm the rebellious middle child.
So you didn't want to follow your sister
I did not want to
Haley
follow
here.
in her footsteps. But the thing about it was she kind of knew the organizations and companies that were on this platform. She knew their reputation. She knew who my boss would be. She knew, what my role would look like. Would I have a lot of autonomy and all of that? So she kind of kept pushing things under the table, saying, hey, you should apply to this.
Yeah.
You should, this looks good. All of that being said. And so now, 3 years later, obviously, I'm here. I joined an organization here, and that, especially because I moved during the pandemic, to have my sister here was a huge help. It was just nice to have family when I live so far away and all of that. And then of course I do have some extended family here, and family in Atlanta and all of that. So to have that alongside, everyone's like, I taught you how to say y'all. I'm like, no, my mom's from Texas. Like, I've been growing up saying y'all before it was cool for everyone to say y'all.
Too.
Yeah, I've been to Birmingham. So that kind of helped ease a lot of the transition of, I didn't have as much culture shock as maybe some of my peers because I had some semblance of roots here when I transitioned here.
Yeah, and I know you said that, even though it was COVID, in some ways it was a good situation because you come, if we all sort of remember summer 2020, a lot of people were starting to see people outdoors, and you have a job when a lot of your peers don't. But I wonder if you could speak specifically to plugging into the Birmingham Jewish community once you get here, and maybe like the things that went really well, but also any challenges there were, and sort of how you approached that.
Yeah, so what I will say is I got my job acceptance. I hadn't accepted it yet, and I'd called BBYO and said, I want to be an advisor. I had actually, someone who had been a mentor to me when I was a teen in BBYO was now working in Nashville. And for those that don't know, BBYO, the region is Tennessee, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi. So anyway, it's all kind of in one. So I called her up and I said, I want to get plugged in. And then I accepted my job and then realized, okay, maybe I need to start my job before I get involved in this. But it was one of my first phone calls was, I know I want to get involved in the Jewish community here. That kind of led me to some other introductions. I remember getting a phone call from a Vermont number saying, hey, welcome to Birmingham. And I was like, I'm still in Chicago. I don't know why I'm getting a Vermont number.
That was me, and I will say that I have a very distinct memory of Natalie Sikora walking into my office with your phone number and saying that you were moving here, and I had to call you that day.
Yes,
so
and I remember
explicitly
not calling you back because I was like so confused. I hadn't moved there yet.
I should probably change my phone number at some point too. The 802 throws people off.
Yeah, I usually tell people, just warning, like this is my number. And of course getting involved in YBIB, kind of going to some of those events.
That's You Belong in Birmingham.
Yeah, You Belong in Birmingham, which is programming for young Jewish adults in the community. So that was definitely a priority of mine, which when envisioning my life post-grad, I would say Judaism was always going to be a part of it, but it was a little bit harder to envision in a place like Birmingham compared to when I was dreaming up of Charlotte or Detroit or, other Philly, other cities that BFA could have potentially brought me. It was a little bit harder to envision, especially because my sister wasn't as involved as I was planning on being.
Yeah.
So she kind of showed me the avenues, but I was the one to actually pursue them. It did make it hard because I moved in September, so the high holidays were something. But it was hard during COVID, and the fact that I had to negotiate that as part of my vacation days because I've now been in 2 positions in Birmingham. I've gotten, obviously, Christmas off, but Good Friday for both of these. I don't celebrate Good Friday, but I do celebrate other holidays that I don't automatically get. Or I know in some more progressive places of work, they'll have holidays that you get to choose to take off. But that was something that I had to kind of pick up the phone and say, hey, is it okay if I swap out my days and things like that? So that was a challenge to just have to advocate for myself in a workplace setting where for a lot of times, or at least in my past experiences, religion hadn't really come up at all.
Yeah.
But in Birmingham, that is something that is
definitely
a connector and kind of a given or an assumption when you go into a workplace. So for me to have been a Northerner, or I guess a Midwesterner, a young Jewish woman, that in my eyes, or at least in my life, none of those had really been deterrents or outliers. For the first time, especially going into a workplace, all of those identities did kind of set me apart from a lot of my peers.
Well, and it's a good point that you're making too about sort of here in Birmingham, there is more of like an assumption about sort of maybe religious homogeneity in the workplace, or you sort of have to make yourself that outlier, which can be hard when you first move to a place. I will say I have a very distinct memory of trying to go to the DMV on Good Friday the first year I lived here. I mean,
I made that
Googling,
mistake.
like, what holiday is it today? So I do get that. But, it's interesting because that came up, sort of the difficulty around high holidays, when we talked a little bit about sort of decision to join or not to join a synagogue, which as a synagogue professional, of course, I have a vested interest in. But I know for a lot of young people, sort of like the vision around what synagogue membership means is changing or evolving in some way. But maybe you can talk a little bit about that, sort of like plugging in to the Jewish community as a whole versus individual synagogues and sort of that whole swirl of decisions.
So I would say my whole life has kind of been like a piecemeal Jewish activity thing. Because I went to day school, we weren't really involved in the community or the synagogue community, even though the Jewish day school was in the building of the synagogue. I had a bat mitzvah with a rabbi, but not at a synagogue.
Where did you have a bat mitzvah out of interest?
I actually had it. It's called East Bank. It's actually a gym.
Okay.
They had an event space, but anyways, my next door neighbor was a rabbi, so we got to it was awesome. We got to build out the service together, and it just so happened to be at the East Bank Club. But that being said, throughout high school, I didn't really stay involved in the synagogue because I wasn't before, but I was still in BBYO, I was still active in the Jewish community. In college, synagogues aren't really a thing. You have your Hillel, you have your Chabad, and that's how you stay involved in Jewish community. And then transitioning to Birmingham, I think it would have been a little bit different had it not been the pandemic. For me, starting the year with the high holidays is really important, but if you're going to do it on Zoom, then I'd rather... I ended up going to a service led by the rabbi at my university because I had a connection to that rabbi. Virtually. And so for me, it had never really been the synagogue is the answer to building Jewish community. If anything, that's always kind of been in the background. And obviously my family here is very connected to the temple, and so hypothetically, if I hadn't moved in 2020, I think I would have had a different answer. But I've been able to build out my Jewish life in Birmingham beyond this, the formal membership of a synagogue.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And it's interesting to hear you speak about, because I do think that there's sort of a generational shift in how people interact with Jewish institutions. So it's just something, interesting to mull over. We're coming close to the end of our time, but I have a few sort of closing questions I want to throw at you. One, you've already spoken a little bit about this, but maybe, always interested as another transplant. I think one thing that's sort of interesting is that Birmingham doesn't actually have a huge transplant culture. So tell us just a little bit about, and you've spoken to this a little bit in the job stuff, but what is it like specifically to be not from here and living here?
Yeah, so in the context of Jewish life?
Yeah, or broader if you want it to be.
Okay.
I'll let you take it how you want.
I'll say, starting from the Jewish side of things, I think in my experience in Memphis was one where if I didn't have a connection to the Jewish community, it was hard to break in. Granted, I was only there for 8 weeks. But there wasn't that same sense of eagerness and thoughtfulness and making people feel at home in the community. And that has been a total different experience here in Birmingham. Again, the number of calls I got before I even moved here, the number of homes that I was welcomed to for Rosh Hashanah and all these meals that I actually had to turn down. So it was just it was definitely a different sense of feeling welcomed and at home here in the Jewish community as a transplant, which has been a really positive experience. And then in general, I think a lot of times, especially early on when I moved here, I had a lot of questions like, is this because I'm now an adult? Is this because it's COVID? Is this because I'm not from here? And it was kind of hard to decipher because a lot of people's transitions out of college into the working world is, you can decipher like, oh, this is because you're an adult paying bills now, or this is because, culture shock. But I feel like I kind of had all of those compounded at the same time.
Plus pandemic.
Yeah, and the pandemic. So I was like, okay, just bring it on. Like, whatever. Everything's changing, and that's fine, and whatever. And I think as someone who maybe likes change too much, it was exciting to learn about a new place and learn about what I enjoy in a new place, what has been a challenge. I think, again, being a Jewish young woman who's early on in her career has not been easy, but that's because it's like the water that I'm swimming in is just different than the water I'd been swimming in before.
And almost like that same, it might be sometimes hard to decipher, is something difficult because you're young, because you're not from here, because you're a woman, because you're Jewish, or is it all those things together? Yeah,
and so then, it's not, the point isn't to necessarily find the answer, it's just to find, clarity enough to move on, or be okay with how people are reacting to you, or how people are working with you, or how people are welcoming you, and so that's just kind of been how it is. I think there's, and this is for the Jewish community and not, there's this balance between Birmingham is a place where people have long roots, and long history, and, but then there's also an eagerness to welcome people in.
Yeah.
And I think that's especially true of the Jewish community compared to the Birmingham community at large. People are eager for new ideas, new backgrounds, new voices. So it's been a cool thing to be a part of, especially at this age. I don't feel like my voice would be heard as loudly and I would be able to be participating in so much if Birmingham wasn't as eager to bring in these new, fresh ideas.
I'm biased, but I do agree with you. I think the Birmingham Jewish community is sort of uniquely welcoming, and that's a really great thing. So I'm glad that you've felt that. For my last question, I'm going to kind of flip a little bit a question that I often end with, which is I usually ask people sort of what they love about being in the Birmingham Jewish community and something that's a challenge. But I do feel like on this theme of fresh ideas, and this is what we all actually want to hear from the young people, I'd love to hear sort of one thing that you've loved that you feel like the community has provided, and one thing that you wish you saw more of coming from the Birmingham Jewish community.
Okay. I think one thing that I have loved in the Jewish community is a way to plug in from a person-first approach. I think a lot of the opportunities to get involved in the Jewish community are coffees or happy hours or Top Golf was one of the first
that was fun.
events. So really recognizing that, yes, Judaism is what connects us, but we can also just be friends and get to know each other and, get to the Judaism elements at people's comfort levels, and when they're ready to do that. So I've really enjoyed being able to experience the city because of plugging into the Jewish community. One thing that I would love to see going forward is there is a lot of Jewish programming for specific age groups. So YBIB is for 22 to...
It's 21 to 35.
21 to 35.
Very large age range.
And so I've gotten to meet a lot of 21 to 35-year-olds.
Yeah.
Probably less so on the higher age because a lot of people who have kids, which is a different chapter of life, don't participate as much. So I've gotten this, I've gotten quality over quantity in terms of really honing in on relationships in my specific chapter of life. But I haven't really been able to plug into the Jewish community as a whole. Luckily, I've gotten to work with some Jewish teens through BBYO, but I would love to really see the breadth of the Jewish community and plug into that rather than me plugging in as a Jewish young adult, but getting to plug into the Birmingham Jewish community, period.
So maybe more like intergenerational opportunities. I agree that we often tend to silo programming a little bit by age range. And so I feel like it's interesting because sometimes I hear that from the younger people and sometimes I hear that from the older people and sometimes I hear that from people in between. Those things can be really nice. It can also be nice to connect across age ranges. So I think that's super valuable.
Yeah.
Well, anything that I haven't asked you that you want to add for our conversation today?
I don't think so. Okay. I think we touched on everything. I just appreciate the space, the very big space, to be able to share my story and get to share it with you because you have been such a wonderful part of my time, especially in the Jewish community here in Birmingham.
I'm glad we finally connected, even though you ignored my initial call.
Well, I apologize for that 3 years later.
Well, we can all give a round of applause to Madeline. Thank you for sharing with us.